We are taught that self-discipline is a test of endurance. Most assume progress scales with suffering, that the harder you push, the more you grow. Human biology rarely follows that linear path. Forcing a nervous system to the absolute edge of discomfort often fails to produce a favorable adaptation. When pressure exceeds a certain limit, the body enters a state of physiological breakdown, stalling any potential for growth to prioritize immediate survival. While motivational platitudes tell us to grind through the pain, behavioral data shows that the human stress response is hardwired to override willpower once distress becomes unmanageable. Viewed as a matter of engineering, resilience becomes a problem of precise calibration rather than a measure of moral strength. To solve that calibration problem, we use the Subjective Units of Discomfort Scale, or SUDs. This provides a standard metric for measuring psychological and physiological stress. This chart plots our ability to adapt and perform on the vertical axis. The horizontal axis tracks the SUD scale, running from 0, complete comfort, up to 100, representing absolute maximum distress. When we plot the traditional concept of grit, we see that as discomfort spikes, performance plummets. Brute force eventually causes the system to collapse. Sustainable growth requires locating a specific threshold on the spectrum, a level of tension that provides enough pressure to change without causing a shutdown. On the low end of the spectrum, between 0 and 30, we find the stagnation zone. In this range, tasks require minimal effort. Because the system experience is easy and familiar, there is no biological pressure to adapt. The brain conserves energy by maintaining existing habits whenever environmental pressure is absent. Operating in this zone looks like maintaining a routine that never challenges your current capacity. It feels safe, but it produces no new results. Remaining strictly within a state of comfort makes meaningful change physiologically unlikely. On the far right, between 80 and 100, stress becomes extreme. This is the breakdown zone. This crash is triggered by hyperarousal, the body's acute stress response. As stress levels peak, the amygdala flares into overdrive, while the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for logic and discipline, effectively dims. This shift means that once panic or extreme distress takes over, you lose access to the executive functions required to follow through on a plan. Behaviors like procrastination and self-sabotage are often the brain's attempt to escape the discomfort of the breakdown zone and return to safety. High-stress environments temporarily inhibit the neurological capacity required to execute long-term goals. Effective growth happens in the middle path, between zero pressure and hyperarousal. The optimal point for development sits at the apex of this curve, roughly between 40 and 65 on the SUD scale. This is the adaptation threshold. This window represents the point where pressure is high enough to demand change, but low enough to avoid triggering a survival-based shutdown. Operating here keeps the executive brain engaged while still forcing the system to reorganize itself to meet a new challenge. High-performance training involves locating this zone and working to stay within it as much as possible. Self-discipline relies on the logistical act of manipulating your environment to keep your internal discomfort inside this specific window. When a mandatory task is massive and triggers a breakdown response, we need a way to manually lower the SUDs. Viewing a daunting project as a single monolithic block often spikes the internal discomfort metric to paralyzing levels. The most effective countermeasure is to utilize ridiculously small changes, fracturing the task into microscopic units. Shrinking the scope of the action, focusing only on putting on your shoes instead of an entire gym session, alters the brain's threat assessment. The SUDs meter drops out of the red and settles into the adaptation threshold. This approach bypasses the unconscious resistance that triggers a shutdown, allowing the prefrontal cortex to remain in control of the action. Fracturing a task serves as a functional mechanism to artificially force your discomfort levels down into a range where execution is possible. Because the S in SUDs stands for subjective, the metric is deeply influenced by how we frame a situation. Every task passes through a cognitive frame, a mental filter that dictates our biological response and determines the final SUDs measurement. Labeling a task as a threat or a burden causes the data to pass through a negative filter. The SUDs meter spikes and the system moves toward a breakdown. By utilizing cognitive restructuring to view the same task as a challenge, the SUD's meter settles into the golden zone, enabling productive action. Stress and excitement share nearly identical physiological states, such as elevated heart rate and narrow focus. The primary difference lies in the cognitive label we apply to those sensations. Changing the label you apply to a stressor allows you to dynamically adjust the limits of your own capacity. Maintaining the optimal threshold is a dynamic process. It requires constant calibration as skills and environments change. Resilience operates as an active management system, not a fixed trait. This adjustment is core to navigating the perennial struggle between our current state and goals. When you find yourself unable to execute, it is helpful to view the issue as a miscalibration of your SUDs, rather than a failure of willpower. Effective systems focus on adjusting the variables of a task until the discomfort level falls back into a range where action can occur. Dissecting complex tasks, restructuring your perspective, manipulates the SUDs metric. These tools reduce exhaustion and eliminate action friction. Operating consistently within the adaptation threshold allows for steady progress without constant, overwhelming suffering. The result is a calibrated behavioral system that functions smoothly, processing challenges without triggering the internal alarms that lead to burnout. Discipline is found in the engineering of your daily experience, ensuring that growth becomes a consistent outcome of how your system is organized.